We're joined by Professor Taras Kuzio. He's Professor of Political Science at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Professor, welcome back to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
So, what do you make of the timing of this reshuffle? Why now?
Well, it shows a growing sense of confidence on the part of Vladimir Putin in his war against Ukraine. He's doing this in the middle of a number of offensives in the Donbass and in the Kharkiv region. So he's confident that this reshuffle will not in any way damage this military operations. And he's obviously confident because of Western malaise, Western slowness in providing military assistance to Ukraine, particularly the US, waited 6 months. But Europe is also dragging its heels. And Russia has been able to adapt its ability to attack, as we've seen, and Ukraine doesn't have the air defenses to stop it. So Putin's on a roll. He thinks he's doing very well, and therefore he can afford to change this. But I think it also reflects a viewpoint in Moscow that this is a long, drawn-out war, that you need to, as it were, align Russia's military economy with the needs of the Russian military. Hence, they're bringing in an economist as Minister of Defense. So that's also a bad sign because on the one hand, we have Russia believing already for quite a long time that Russia is at war with the West, whereas Western countries, in particularly US and Germany, seem to be unwilling to accept this reality that we are, in effect, in a third world war. It's not a declared war. It's not a war between NATO and Russia. It's an indirect war, but there's a war going on. Russia is acting as though it's at war. We are not.
So having that in mind, especially now as we do see that now, for instance, in Brussels, there are two different headquarters. On one side, we have EU. There is also NATO headquarters. And it seems that there is a lot of stir. And of course, we are talking a lot about alignment. And these are big words. But it seems that, Europe, or the so-called brother West, as of now, is lacking a very clear leadership or leadership role within the bloc. And we do know that Russia responds well only to power. So how do you think that now the so-called West should act in order to counter what Russia is doing?
Well, it needs to do, at least in the immediate future, immediately, very importantly, is to send air defense. Ukraine, a few months ago, sort of 6 months ago, was able to shoot down something like 75–80% of Russian missiles and drones. And now that's dropped to about 45%. Russia's attacks are very brutal. They are destroying utilities. I don't understand why the West doesn't understand this. I mean, after all, Russia's been doing this for the last 2 winters. It's nothing new. The attacks are becoming, so that's one important area, air defense. Secondly, it needs to take its gloves off and stop pretending that this is a gentleman's war. It's not a gentleman's war. So, for example, Western countries need to, particularly the US, needs to stop preventing Ukraine from using Western weapons against targets inside Russia. This allows Russia to build up forces on its border, like, for example, in the Kharkiv operation, and then to invade without Ukraine being able to attack those forces that are building up inside Russia on the border. So, unfortunately, Russia has never had its gloves on. Russia is flouting every international law, but the West is acting as though this is like a fight between nice, calm, passive gentlemen, and that's not the case. The two worst, I think, culprits here are what I'm sure Polish listeners and viewers will know a long time ago, is President Biden is very weak on these questions. And, of course, German Chancellor Scholz. I mean, these are two weak links in the Western leaders. And Macron, President of France, is adopting a more bellicose stance, but we are still, many of us, suspect about whether France will in the end send troops to Ukraine if there's a breakthrough. But it's very simple. If Ukraine fails to stop this incessant Russian offensives, then Poland, the Baltic states, and NATO will be at war directly with Russia. It's very simple. So I don't understand why this has not sunk in yet in the West. But
well, I think many people would agree with you on that one, Professor, because that message has been transmitted since the start of the war, not least by TVP World. Now, you talk about taking the gloves off. The UK did that, did they not, when they supplied missiles to Ukraine and said, you know, fire inside Russian territory if you need to. Do you think that they are going to start a trend in that direction?
I'm not so sure. I mean, the problem is that practically every Western country except the US bought into this idea that history ended in 1991, the famous quote, and that there's a need for a democratic dividend. We all reduce our military budgets. And so Britain has been taking the lead in this and sending tanks and missiles. But, you know, Britain's cupboard is already bare. Britain also, strangely, under the Conservatives, reduced its military budget. And still only 18 countries out of 31 NATO members spend more than 2% of GDP on defense. I mean, it's better than it was in 2014 when only 5 countries spent more than 2%. But still, that means that 13 NATO members do not spend 2%. So I think there's a need to ratchet up the defense budgets and defense industry in the West in the same way as Russia has doing. It's easier for Russia. It's an authoritarian system. But yes, those weapons need to be allowed to be used by Ukraine against targets inside Russia. That is the only way this can be halted, really.
And certainly we do see that some tangible change needs to be implemented. And like you mentioned, that some clear leadership also needs to be found. Perhaps it's not Joe Biden, perhaps it's not German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. I think that's an open question. Who might it be? In the meantime, Professor, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much for inviting me.